Long before Darth Vader walked the halls of the Empire, long before Darth Bane created the rule of two, before even the ancient Sith Empire rose from the ashes of forgotten wars, there was a moment in galactic history when the greatest threat to the Jedi Order did not come from outside the Order, it came from within. A group of Jedi scholars, brilliant, powerful, and dangerously curious, began to ask a forbidden question. What if the dark side of the Force was not something to fear, but something to master? At the center of this movement stood one of the most influential Jedi Masters of his generation, a man whose ambition and belief in forbidden knowledge would ignite the first great civil war among Force users. His name was Ajunta Pall, and the consequences of his fall would echo across the galaxy for the next 5,000 years. At this moment in galactic history, the Republic was still expanding across the stars. The hyperlanes that connected the galaxy were growing wider with every century. Trade flourished, worlds joined the Republic, and the Jedi Order had become something more than philosophers and scholars. They had become guardians of peace. But the Jedi were not soldiers. Their purpose was not conquest or power. Instead, they served as mediators, explorers, and protectors of balance within the Force. The Jedi Code taught restraint. Emotion was dangerous. Attachment could lead to fear. Fear led to anger, and anger led to the dark side. To most Jedi, these teachings were obvious truths earned through thousands of years of hard experience, but to others, they seemed like limitations. Among the vast libraries and research enclaves of the Jedi Order were scholars who believed the Council had become too cautious, too afraid. They believed the Force was not something to be divided into light and dark. Instead, they argued that the Force should be studied in its entirety. Every aspect, every mystery, every forbidden secret. If the Jedi truly wished to understand the Force, they argued, then they must explore all of it. This belief would become the seed of the greatest disaster the Order had yet faced. Among the Jedi researchers who pushed these ideas further than anyone else was a powerful and respected Jedi Master named Ajunta Pall. Ajunta Pall was not a reckless Padawan or an impatient knight. He was a seasoned master with an extraordinary mind. He had studied the Force for decades. His knowledge of ancient history, Force traditions, and forgotten civilizations made him one of the most influential scholars within the Order. Many younger Jedi admired him. To them, Pall represented something exciting. A Jedi who was not afraid to challenge tradition. A Jedi who believed that knowledge should never be forbidden. At first, Pall's research appeared harmless. He studied ancient texts, examined artifacts recovered from lost worlds, investigated the strange abilities displayed by Force traditions that existed outside the Jedi Order. But over time, his research began to take a darker turn. Among the relics discovered in ancient ruins were objects created by civilizations that had embraced the dark side. Some of these artifacts possessed incredible power. Weapons infused with dark energy, holocrons containing knowledge the Jedi had long forbidden, techniques capable of manipulating life itself. To the Jedi Council, these artifacts were dangerous and corrupting. To Ajunta Pall, they were opportunities. Pall and his followers began experimenting with techniques drawn from these ancient artifacts. They believed they could study the dark side without becoming corrupted by it. After all, they were Jedi, masters of discipline, scholars of the Force. They believed they were strong enough to control the darkness. But the dark side is not simply another tool. It is seductive. It whispers promises of power, and slowly, almost invisibly, it begins to change those who touch it. Paul's experiments grew increasingly extreme. His followers began studying force alchemy, an ancient and forbidden practice. Through dark side energy, force alchemy allowed living beings to be reshaped into something else entirely. Creatures could be strengthened, mutated, twisted into monstrous forms. At first, the researchers believed these experiments could create new life forms that would serve the Republic. Guardians stronger than any soldier, creatures designed to defend the galaxy from threats. But the results were horrifying. Some experiments created beasts that could barely be controlled. Others resulted in grotesque failures that suffered in constant agony. Still, the experiments continued, because with each attempt, the researchers felt the power of the dark side growing stronger within them. And power is difficult to abandon once it has been tasted. The Jedi Council had been watching these developments carefully. At first, they hoped the research would remain contained. They believed Paul and his followers could be persuaded to abandon their dangerous path. But as reports of the experiments grew more disturbing, the Council realized the situation had become much more serious. These Jedi were not merely studying the dark side, they were embracing it. The Council issued a direct command. All research into dark side techniques must stop immediately. All artifacts connected to forbidden knowledge must be surrendered to the Order. Ajunta Pall and his followers were ordered to return to the Jedi Temple and submit themselves for evaluation. For many Jedi, this would have been the end of the matter, but Paul had already crossed a line from which there was no easy return. He believed the Council's decision was driven by fear of progress, fear of power, fear of knowledge. To Paul, the Jedi Order had become stagnant, bound by ancient traditions that prevented them from reaching their true potential. And so he made a decision that would shatter the Order forever. He refused the Council's command. Paul gathered his followers and publicly rejected the authority of the Jedi Council. The Jedi Order had never seen anything like this before. A group of Jedi openly defying the Order's leadership, declaring that they would continue their research regardless of the consequences. Paul's followers believed they were pioneers, explorers of forbidden knowledge. But to the Jedi Council, they had become something else entirely. They had become Dark Jedi. For the first time since the ancient Force Wars on Tython, Jedi would raise their weapons against their own brothers and sisters. What followed would become known throughout history as the 100-Year Darkness. The conflict between the Jedi Order and the Dark Jedi spread across the Republic. Entire systems became battlefields. Paul's followers unleashed creatures created through force alchemy. Gigantic monsters called Leviathans were released upon unsuspecting worlds. These creatures were specifically designed to hunt Jedi streak teams. Entire Jedi streak teams were devoured before the Order learned how to counter them. Meanwhile, the Dark Jedi experimented with increasingly destructive techniques. They created weapons capable of devastating entire ecosystems. They turned living beings into soldiers through dark side manipulation. Each year, the war grew darker, and each year the Dark Jedi fell deeper into corruption. What had begun as a philosophical disagreement had become a war for the soul of the Jedi Order. Despite their terrifying powers, the Dark Jedi faced a problem that would ultimately doom them. The dark side encouraged ambition. But ambition often led to betrayal. Paul's followers began competing with each other for dominance. Some sought to surpass their master. Others attempted to seize control of their growing armies. The unity that once made them powerful began to crumble. Meanwhile, the Jedi Order adapted. They developed new tactics to counter the alchemical creatures. Jedi streak teams destroyed dark Jedi laboratories across multiple systems. One by one, the fallen Jedi were hunted down. Eventually, the conflict reached its final confrontation. The dark Jedi forces were defeated, their strongholds destroyed, and Ajunta Pall himself was captured. The Jedi Council now faced a terrible choice. Executing the fallen Jedi would violate the principles the Order stood for.
The Battle of Korriban should have been the end. After a century of darkness, the Jedi had finally defeated the fallen masters who once stood among them. The creatures of alchemy were destroyed, the Leviathans hunted down, the dark strongholds burned from the stars. And at the center of it all stood the leader of the rebellion, Ajunta Pall. Once a respected Jedi researcher, now the most feared dark side practitioner in the galaxy. But when the war ended, the Jedi faced a question they had never answered before. What do you do with Jedi who have fallen so far? Execution would have been easy. Justice would have been simple. But the Jedi were not executioners. Instead, the Council chose mercy. Ajunta Pall and the surviving Dark Jedi were not killed, they were exiled. Loaded onto unarmed ships, given basic supplies, and sent beyond the borders of Republic space, into the unknown regions where no hyperlanes existed and no maps could guide them. The Jedi believed this would end the threat forever. Few in the Republic understood that this decision would change galactic history, because exile did not destroy the Dark Jedi. It transformed them. For months, their ships drifted through unexplored space. Supplies dwindled, followers died, but the dark side sustained them. And then, at the edge of known space, they discovered a world, Korriban, a barren, crimson planet surrounded by jagged valleys and ancient tombs. But Korriban was not empty. It was home to a primitive species already steeped in dark side rituals, a red-skinned people who called themselves the Sith. To them, the arrival of the exiles was nothing short of divine. Ships fell from the sky carrying beings who wielded powers beyond imagination, force lightning, telekinesis, sorcery. The Sith species believed the newcomers were gods, and Ajunta Pall did nothing to correct them. After years of defeat, humiliation, and exile, he finally stood before a people who would kneel. So he accepted the role. Ajunta Pall declared himself the Dark Lord of the Sith. His followers adopted the title Sith Lords, merging their Jedi training with the dark traditions of the native Sith. And something entirely new was born, a civilization built not on balance, not on peace, but on power. The exiled Dark Jedi took Sith spouses, producing descendants stronger in the Force than either species alone. They built temples across Korriban's valleys, they raised pyramids over the tombs of their rulers, and they created a society where strength determined everything. The strong ruled, the weak served, and betrayal was simply the path to power. Over time, the exiled Jedi were no longer seen as outsiders. They became the ruling class of a new empire, the Sith Empire. What the Jedi had exiled as a handful of defeated rebels had now become something far more dangerous. because the Sith had learned from their defeat. They would not rush into war again. They would grow, study, plan, and one day they would return. For centuries, the Republic remained unaware of what had been created in the darkness beyond known space. But deep beneath the sands of Korriban, Ajunta Pall's tomb would become the first in a long line of Sith burial chambers, a monument to the moment when the Jedi unknowingly forged their greatest enemy. What began as a rebellion had become a legacy, and in time, that legacy would threaten the entire galaxy. Because the Sith were no longer just fallen Jedi. They were something new, something patient, something ancient, something waiting. And when they finally returned to Republic space, the war between Jedi and Sith would truly begin.
If you enjoyed this journey into the ancient history of the galaxy, consider subscribing to the channel so you don't miss the next chapter. Many more legends from the Old Republic are still waiting to be uncovered. Subscribe and continue exploring the hidden stories of the Force.